Don't worry about your challenges, just increase your tithe and offering and give it to me, God would embarrass your account.
These are the popular words of Pastor John. The church now contains members that have suffered from one hustling job to another dirty job. Some of them working as laborers in construction sites, but it was not so from the beginning. What really happened? The room fell silent, an almost eerie contrast to the raucous applause that had erupted moments before. Pastor John's booming voice filled the grandiose auditorium as he concluded his fiery sermon on the seed of prosperity. His gold watch glinted under the bright lights, and his tailored suit hugged his frame perfectly. "Give, and it shall be given unto you," he declared, his hands raised heavenward. His voice reverberated, commanding attention, but in the pit of his stomach unease churned. A faint whisper of doubt he refused to acknowledge. The congregation erupted into applause, though the faces beneath the clamor were marked with desperation and hope. They had heard this sermon countless times before, but each time they clung to his words like a drowning man clinging to driftwood. Pastor John surveyed the crowd, his eyes flitting over familiar faces. Sister Glory in the back row, her frail hands clutching a crumpled envelope. She had sold her last chicken to give this offering beside her. Mr. Goodluck, who had lost his job months ago, fidgeted with his empty wallet, his sunken eyes betraying months of hunger. Madam Blessing sat with her 2 children, their clothes faded and torn, their faces hollow. The auditorium brimmed with reverence, yet despair lurked in every corner, unspoken but palpable. "God's blessings are coming to you," Pastor John assured them, his voice dripping with charisma. "Keep sowing your seeds, and he will open the windows of heaven." He extended his arms as if to embrace them all, but the gesture felt hollow, even to him. Behind the applause, whispers murmured, soft and ominous, a tide beginning to turn. And in the farthest corner of the room, a figure in the shadows observed with steely eyes, not a congregant, but an investigator. Hidden in the sea of bowed heads and raised hands, this outsider carried secrets that could unravel everything Pastor John had so carefully constructed. The luxury of Pastor John's life contrasted starkly with the hardship of his congregation. His driveway boasted a fleet of luxury cars, from sleek sports cars to imposing SUVs. His mansion, nestled in the suburbs, was a testament to opulence, with its marble floors and shimmering chandeliers. This was a far cry from his humble beginnings when he had started the ministry with pure intentions. Back then, he had gone door to door, praying for people and sharing their burdens. But somewhere along the way, something changed. The city's temptations, the allure of wealth, and the pressure to compete with his millionaire colleagues chipped away at his sincerity. Pastor John's sermons became more about financial prosperity and less about spiritual growth. He began to see his congregation not as souls to be nurtured, but as resources to be exploited. Behind closed doors, Pastor John managed a growing portfolio of real estate investments in New York, funded entirely by the congregation's offerings. He told them their money was going toward missionary projects overseas, but in reality, not a single dollar left his control. Uncle Johnson, an elderly deacon who had once been a confidant, began to suspect something was amiss one evening. Uncle Johnson approached Pastor John. "Pastor, the people are suffering. Shouldn't we use the church's resources to help them?" he asked tentatively. Pastor John's face darkened. "Uncle Johnson, God's work requires sacrifice. If they're faithful, he will reward them. You should focus on your duties and leave these matters to me." His tone was final, brooking no argument. But what Pastor John didn't anticipate was the quiet determination of the aging deacon. That very night, Uncle Johnson began an investigation of his own. With trembling hands, he searched through records, emails, and financial statements. Hours later, his heart sank as he uncovered a damning truth. Funds marked for missionary projects were rerouted to shell companies tied to Pastor John's personal accounts. The betrayal was deeper than Uncle Johnson had imagined. Despite his discovery, Uncle Johnson knew confronting Pastor John outright would be dangerous. He decided to enlist help discreetly. First, he reached out to Sister Glory and Madam Blessing. "We cannot let this continue," he confided, sharing the incriminating evidence. "But we must tread carefully. Pastor John has many allies." Their alliance was forged in secrecy, and they worked under the cover of darkness to gather more proof. As their investigation deepened, an unexpected twist emerged. Evidence hinted at a larger network. Pastor John wasn't acting alone. He was part of an intricate web of corruption involving external investors and even influential city figures. Each discovery brought new risks, but also strengthened their resolve. Unbeknownst to them, Pastor John began to sense the walls closing in. One of his confidants, a church accountant, reported unusual activity surrounding the financial records. Paranoia gnawed at him, but he brushed it off as overthinking. No one will dare challenge me, he reassured himself, yet a growing fear lingered. The foundation of his empire wasn't just cracking, it was on the verge of collapse. By the time Uncle Johnson and his team were ready to act, the stakes had reached their peak. The question was no longer just about justice. It was about surviving the storm their revelations would unleash. The congregation began to stir with unease. Whispers of dissatisfaction and suspicion spread like wildfire. Sister Glory, ever the faithful believer, found herself questioning the sermon she had so eagerly consumed. During a midweek prayer meeting, she confided in Madam Blessing. "Something feels off," she whispered, clutching her Bible tightly. "The promises aren't coming true. Why are we growing poorer while Pastor's wealth multiplies?" Madam Blessing nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "My children are starving, Glory. I gave the last of my money to the church for that overseas mission. But what if there is no mission?" The revelation hung in the air between them like a heavy cloud. They resolved to investigate, driven by desperation and a flicker of doubt they couldn't extinguish. That night, they secretly met in Madam Blessing's tiny kitchen, poring over every church flyer, bulletin, and announcement. It didn't take long to find inconsistencies, projects that had supposedly been funded years ago but showed no evidence of ever existing. Meanwhile, Pastor John continued his double life, oblivious to the growing unrest. At his lavish home, he hosted a gathering of influential businessmen, discussing his next real estate acquisition. "This project will bring in millions," he boasted, raising a glass of expensive wine. The men laughed and toasted to their success, unaware that their conversations were overheard by one of the maids, a young woman named Rachel, who had grown suspicious of Pastor John's wealth. She secretly recorded their discussion, her hands trembling as she realized the magnitude of the deceit. As the days passed, paranoia crept into Pastor John's mind. Uncle Johnson's recent questions had unsettled him, and now he noticed the subtle shifts in his congregation's demeanor. People avoided his gaze. Their applause during sermons lacked the fervor they once had, and attendance at church events began to dwindle. What if others began to pry? He resolved to tighten his grip on the congregation, using fear and guilt to silence dissent. "Beware of wolves among you," he preached one Sunday, his voice thunderous. "The enemy seeks to destroy this ministry through lies and division. Stay vigilant and keep sowing your seeds." But the seeds of rebellion had already been sown. Sister Glory and Madam Blessing approached Uncle Johnson with their findings, and together they pieced together the intricate web of deceit. When Rachel came forward with her recording, it was the final piece of the puzzle. The trio's determination deepened, but so did the risks. Pastor John had powerful allies, and any misstep could lead to ruin. Or worse. The tension mounted as they prepared to take the next step, each night filled with whispered plans and prayers for courage. Unbeknownst to them, Pastor John was also preparing. His instincts told him betrayal was brewing, and he began quietly investigating his closest confidants. The stage was set for a confrontation, but no one could predict how far each side was willing to go, and who would emerge unscathed. Uncle Johnson couldn't shake his unease. He began quietly digging into the church's finances, poring over records late at night. His heart pounded as he unearthed one incriminating document after another. Transactions labeled for missionary work were instead funneled into personal accounts tied to Pastor John's real estate ventures. The old man's hands trembled as he stared at the evidence, the weight of betrayal pressing down on him. Unable to sleep, Uncle Johnson prayed for guidance. "Lord, show me what to do," he whispered, his voice breaking under the weight of what he had uncovered. His hands trembled as he gripped the folder of damning evidence tighter. Sleep had evaded him for weeks, replaced by a gnawing dread that this confrontation could change everything, perhaps even cost him his life. The next Sunday, as the congregation spilled out of the church after the service, Johnson waited by the pastor's office, his heart hammering in his chest. The air was thick with the echoes of the choir's hymns, but to him it felt ominous, like the calm before a storm. When Pastor John finally emerged, his jovial demeanor faltered for a split second upon seeing Johnson's grave expression. "Uncle Johnson." "Always a pleasure," Pastor John greeted, his practiced warm smile in place. "I need to speak with you. Privately," Johnson said, his voice trembling but resolute. There was no small talk, no preamble. The weight of his words left no room for pleasantries. Inside the office, Johnson closed the door behind them, his hands shaking slightly as he placed the folder on the desk. "I know what you've done," he began, his voice gaining strength. "You've been lying to us, stealing from God's people." Pastor John's expression darkened for a fleeting moment before his charismatic facade returned. He leaned back in his chair, a patronizing smirk playing on his lips. "Uncle Johnson, you're mistaken," he said smoothly. "These funds are being used for God's glory. You mustn't believe every rumor you hear." But Johnson didn't waver. "Save your lies," he said, his voice rising slightly as he slid the folder across the desk. "I have proof." Pastor John's confident smirk dissolved as he opened the folder. His eyes darted over the contents, and for the first time, fear flickered in his gaze. He shut the folder abruptly, beads of sweat forming on his brow as he glanced toward the door. Lowering his voice, he leaned in closer to Johnson. "You don't understand. There are bigger forces at play here. Drop this. For your own good." Johnson's blood ran cold at the veiled threat, but his resolve only hardened. "The congregation deserves the truth," he retorted. "I've been a part of this church since it was a single room with wooden benches. I've seen leaders rise and fall, but this, what you've done, isn't just a betrayal of trust. It's a betrayal of God himself." Pastor John's mask slipped further, a glimpse of desperation flashing across his face. For a moment it seemed as though he might beg or confess, but instead, his voice turned cold. "You think you can stand against me, Johnson? You're just an old man clinging to ideals. People will believe what I tell them, not your baseless accusations." The words stung, but Johnson refused to back down. "We'll see who they believe," he said, his voice steady now, a quiet determination emanating from him. As he turned to leave, he felt the weight of the battle ahead. But his faith anchored him. He knew exposing the truth would come at a price, but he was willing to pay it. Pastor John's mask slipped further, revealing a glimpse of the desperation beneath. He quickly dismissed Uncle Johnson, but the encounter left both men rattled. That night, Pastor John convened a secret meeting with his closest allies, warning them of a potential threat. "Johnson is meddling where he shouldn't," he said grimly. "We need to act before this spirals out of control." Meanwhile, Uncle Johnson reached out to Sister Glory and Madam Blessing, sharing his findings. "We can't keep this to ourselves," he said, his voice shaking with a mix of fear and determination. "But we must tread carefully. Pastor John has powerful allies." Their secret alliance took root, and they began gathering more evidence. But just as they thought they were making progress, strange things started happening. Uncle Johnson's home was broken into, his documents ransacked. Sister Glory received anonymous phone calls warning her to stay silent. Madam Blessing noticed strangers loitering near her home. The intimidation tactics were clear, but they only deepened their resolve. Unbeknownst to them, Pastor John was orchestrating these scare tactics while struggling to contain his own crumbling facade. His paranoia grew with each passing day, and he began to lash out at his inner circle, suspecting even his closest confidants of betrayal. What he didn't know was that his web of deceit was unraveling faster than he could repair it. The stage was set for a battle of wits and wills, where trust, faith, and courage would be tested like never before. Uncle Johnson enlisted Sister Glory and Madam Blessing to help expose Pastor John. Together, they gathered evidence, bank statements, fake missionary reports, and testimonials from struggling members of the congregation. Their breakthrough came when a local journalist, Clara Martins, caught wind of the rumors. A seasoned investigative reporter known for her unyielding pursuit of truth, Clara decided this story was too significant to ignore. Her approach was methodical and daring. She infiltrated the congregation under the guise of a struggling believer seeking solace. Her hidden camera, concealed within a plain, nondescript handbag, chronicled weeks of sermons, meetings, and interactions with church leaders. The footage she gathered painted a stark picture. Pastor John delivering emotionally charged sermons about sacrificial giving while flaunting his wealth with a cavalier attitude. Behind the scenes, Clara managed to record private conversations that revealed startling admissions. One evening, she captured an exchange between Pastor John and a close confidant where he laughed off the notion of overseas missions, dismissing it as a necessary myth. The stakes rose dramatically when Clara followed a lead about Pastor John's real estate ventures. Using a tip from Rachel, the courageous maid, Clara uncovered documents linking the church's funds to properties in some of New York's most affluent neighborhoods. It was a trail of greed and deceit that extended far beyond the church's walls. As Clara prepared her report, the tension in the church escalated. Pastor John, growing increasingly paranoid, delivered fiery sermons, warning of wolves in sheep's clothing and attacks on God's anointed. The congregation was torn, with some defending him vehemently while others grew suspicious. When the exposé finally aired on national television, it was nothing short of a bombshell. Clara's report was a masterclass in investigative journalism. featuring damning footage, financial records, and testimonials from disillusioned congregants. The revelations were staggering. Millions siphoned from the faithful, phantom missionary projects, and a sprawling real estate empire funded by deceit. One segment showed Pastor John dismissing questions about his extravagant lifestyle, claiming it was a reflection of divine favor. The fallout was swift and unforgiving. Federal agents raided Pastor John's estate, confiscating assets that included luxury cars, jewelry, and bank accounts. Protesters gathered outside the church, their faces a mix of anger and betrayal. Some wept openly, mourning the loss of a man they had trusted with their souls. Pastor John was taken into custody, facing an avalanche of charges including fraud, embezzlement, and money laundering. But the story didn't end there. Clara's exposé ignited a national conversation about corruption within religious institutions. News outlets picked up the story, dissecting the mechanisms of Pastor John's empire. In the shadows, his former allies began to turn on him, eager to cut deals and save themselves from legal repercussions. Meanwhile, Uncle Johnson, Sister Glory, and Madam Blessing found themselves thrust into the limelight as symbols of courage and resilience. Their journey, fraught with danger and heartache, had finally borne the fruit of justice. The church, now under the leadership of Uncle Johnson and a newly formed committee, embarked on a difficult yet hopeful journey of rebuilding trust and community. Transparency became their cornerstone. Every penny donated was meticulously accounted for and used to aid struggling members, renovate the church, and fund legitimate outreach projects. The sight of new programs providing food, clothing, and education to the congregation's most vulnerable began to restore faith in what had once seemed irreparably broken. Sister Glory and Madam Blessing, forever changed by their ordeal, took their advocacy to a national stage. They shared their harrowing experiences at seminars, churches, and media outlets, calling for stronger measures to ensure accountability in religious institutions. Their passion ignited a movement, inspiring congregants across the nation to question, verify, and hold their leaders accountable. Clara Martin's exposé became a landmark in investigative journalism. Beyond the awards and accolades, her work prompted legislative discussions about nonprofit financial transparency. She was approached by publishers and networks, but she chose to focus on mentoring young journalists, teaching them the value of truth and courage in uncovering injustice. Meanwhile, Pastor John sat in his stark prison cell, his world reduced to cold walls and regretful silence. Letters from his former congregants occasionally reached him, some expressing anger, others forgiveness. Each one was a reminder of the lives he had impacted, both harmed and inspired, and the weight of his choices. The loneliness of his nights was pierced only by the memories of his rise and fall, and the flicker of a conscience now awakened too late. Justice had indeed been served, but the journey to healing was far from over. For the congregation, however, hope was no longer tethered to the promises of one man. Instead, it grew from their collective resilience, their newfound unity, and the enduring belief that even in the face of betrayal, truth and faith could shine through the darkest of times. The church's bell rang out each Sunday, not as a call to blind devotion, but as a beacon of a community reclaiming its soul. I hope you enjoyed the tale. If so, please like the video, share it with your family and friends, comment on it, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel and turn on the notification bell for more enchanting tales like this one. Goodbye.